When Paul Walker walked through the glass doors of St. Michael's Children's Hospital dressed in torn jeans and a faded hoodie, no one recognized him, not the security guard, not the receptionist, and certainly not the hospital administrator who was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. What began as a quiet visit to bring hope to sick children turned into a confrontation that would expose the cruelty hidden behind polished professionalism, and, by the time the truth came out, the man who judged Paul by his clothes would learn a lesson he'd never forget. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets of Los Angeles still glistened under the late afternoon sun. Puddles reflected the orange glow of streetlights. Beginning to flicker on as evening approached, St. Michael's Children's Hospital stood on a quiet corner, its modern glass facade gleaming like a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Inside the lobby, the air was sterile and cold. White walls, gray floors, the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with something sweeter, maybe flowers from the gift shop near the entrance. A few visitors sat scattered across plastic chairs, some staring at their phones, others at nothing in particular. Paul Walker stood outside for a moment, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. He wore a gray hoodie with a small tear near the shoulder, scuffed sneakers that had walked thousands of miles, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was unshaven, his hair slightly messy. He looked like someone who had been living rough, and that was exactly the point Paul had been planning. This visit for weeks, not as a celebrity, not as an actor, just as a man who wanted to bring some light into the lives of kids who were fighting battles no child should ever face. He had called ahead, spoken to a nurse named Maria, who coordinated volunteer visits. She had been thrilled. "The kids will love it," she'd said, but Paul had made one request. "Don't tell anyone who I am. I want to meet them as just me." Now, standing outside the hospital, Paul took a deep breath. He wasn't nervous about meeting the kids. He was nervous about everything else, about being judged, about being seen as less than, because even though he knew this was temporary, even though he could walk away from this disguise whenever he wanted, there were people who lived this reality every single day, and they deserved better. Paul pushed through the glass doors. The lobby was warmer than the street outside, but the atmosphere felt colder somehow. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A television mounted on the wall played a muted news program. Near the reception desk, a security guard stood with his arms crossed, scanning everyone who entered with a practiced eye. Paul approached the desk. Behind it sat a young woman in scrubs, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She looked up as he approached, her expression polite but guarded. "Hi," Paul said softly. "I'm here to see the kids on the 4th floor. Maria should have—" "Name?" the receptionist interrupted, her fingers already hovering over the keyboard. "Paul," she typed, her eyes scanning the screen. A small frown appeared on her face. "Paul Walker?" "Yeah." She looked up at him now, really looked at him. Her eyes traveled from his torn hoodie to his scuffed shoes, then back to his face. The frown deepened. "I don't see you in the system." Paul shifted his weight. "Maria told me she'd add me to the volunteer list. I called last week." The receptionist clicked a few more keys, then shook her head. "There's nothing here. Are you sure you have the right day?" Before Paul could respond, a voice cut through the lobby like a blade. "Excuse me." Paul turned. A man in his late 40s approached from a side hallway. He wore an expensive navy suit, perfectly tailored, with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was slicked back, his expression sharp and assessing. This was Richard Donovan, the hospital administrator, and from the way he carried himself, it was clear he viewed himself as the gatekeeper of this place. Richard stopped a few feet away, his eyes sweeping over Paul with barely concealed distaste. "Can I help you with something?" Paul met his gaze calmly. "I'm here to visit the children's wing. I spoke with one of the nurses last week." "Did you now?" Richard's tone was condescending, dripping with skepticism. He turned to the receptionist. "Sarah, is this man registered?" Sarah shook her head. "No, sir, there's no record of him." Richard turned back to Paul, crossing his arms. "I see. And you just thought you'd walk in here and, what, visit sick children?" Paul kept his voice steady. "I coordinated with Maria. She's a nurse on the 4th floor. If you call her, she can confirm." "I don't need to call anyone," Richard interrupted. "I know how this hospital operates. We have strict protocols for a reason. We can't just let anyone wander through our halls, especially not someone who looks like they wandered in off the street." The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Paul felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not anger, something sadder, disappointment. He had known this might happen. But knowing it and experiencing it were two different things. "I understand you have protocols," Paul said carefully, "but if you just..." "No," Richard's voice was firm. "I don't know what you're trying to do here, but we have vulnerable children in this hospital. We can't allow just anyone to access them, especially not someone who..." He trailed off, his eyes once again scanning Paul's appearance. "Someone who..." "What?" Paul asked quietly. Richard didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to the security guard near the entrance. "Marcus, please escort this gentleman out of the building." The guard, a large man in his 50s with kind eyes, hesitated. He looked at Paul, then at Richard, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, Now, Marcus." Marcus sighed and stepped forward. "Sorry, man. I'm just doing my job." Paul nodded. "It's okay." He looked back at Richard one last time. "You know, I've met a lot of people in my life. Some of them had nothing. Some of them had everything, and I learned something important. The way you treat someone when you think they can't do anything for you. That's who you really are." Richard's jaw tightened. "Save the philosophy, just leave." Paul turned and walked toward the exit. As he passed the receptionist's desk, he caught Sarah's eye. She looked away quickly, embarrassed. Outside, the air felt colder than before. Paul stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring back at the hospital. Through the glass doors, he could see Richard speaking to Sarah, gesturing dismissively. The security guard, Marcus, stood off to the side, his expression troubled. Paul pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Maria? Yeah, it's me. Listen, there's been a situation." 15 minutes later, Maria emerged from the hospital, her face flushed with anger. She found Paul sitting on a bench across the street. "I am so sorry," she said, sitting down beside him. "I told Richard you were coming. I confirmed it twice. I don't know what happened." Paul shook his head. "It's not your fault." Maria looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression softened. "You did this on purpose, didn't you? The clothes, the whole thing." Paul smiled faintly. "I wanted to see how people would react. I wanted to understand what it feels like to be invisible, to be judged before you even open your mouth." Maria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, there's a little girl on the 4th floor. Her name is Emma. She's 7 years old. She has leukemia, and every day she asks if anyone's coming to visit. She doesn't care what they look like. She just wants someone to care." Paul stood up. "Then let's go see Emma." Maria blinked. "What?" "I'm not leaving," Paul said firmly. "Not until I do what I came here to do." Maria smiled. "Okay, but this time, we're going through the back entrance." As they walked around the side of the building, Paul felt something shift inside him. Richard Donovan had tried to make him feel small, but what Richard didn't understand was that Paul Walker had spent his entire life learning one simple truth: your worth isn't determined by what you wear, what you drive, or how much money you have. It's determined by what you do when no one's watching. And tonight, Paul was about to prove that to a man who had forgotten what really mattered. Through a side door marked "Staff Only," Maria led Paul down a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic, maybe the cleaning solution they used on the floors. The walls here were older, painted a dull beige that had yellowed with time. This wasn't the polished, public-facing part of the hospital. This was the behind-the-scenes, where the real work happened. Maria swiped her badge at a security panel, and the door clicked open. They stepped into a stairwell, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. "Richard's been administrator here for 3 years, Maria said as they climbed. "He came from some fancy hospital in New York. He's all about appearances, about donors, about making sure everything looks perfect for the board." Paul said nothing, just listened. "But the thing is," Maria continued, her voice tight with frustration, "he forgets why we're here. It's not about the building, it's not about the fundraising galas, it's about the kids." They reached the 4th floor, and Maria paused before opening the door. She turned to Paul, her expression serious. "There are 12 children on this wing right now," she said. "Some are fighting cancer, some have genetic disorders, some are here because they were born too early and their bodies are still learning how to survive, and every single one of them deserves to be seen, to be heard, to feel like they matter." Paul nodded. "Then let's make sure they know they do." Maria pushed open the door, and they stepped into the children's wing. The contrast to the cold, sterile lobby downstairs was immediate. Here, the walls were painted in soft pastels, blues, yellows, pinks, drawings made by young. Hands were taped everywhere, colorful bursts of imagination amid the medical equipment. A mobile of paper butterflies hung from the ceiling near the nurse's station, rotating slowly in the air conditioning's gentle breeze. A young nurse looked up from her computer, her face breaking into a wide smile when she saw Maria. "Finally! I was starting to think you'd forgotten." "Never," Maria said, then gestured to Paul. "This is the visitor I told you about." The young nurse's eyes widened slightly as she took in Paul's appearance, but she didn't say anything judgmental. Instead, she smiled warmly. "The kids are going to love this." Paul followed Maria down the hallway, past rooms with open doors where he could see small figures lying in beds, some connected to IVs, others surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed. Some rooms were decorated with balloons and stuffed animals, others were sparse, clinical. Heartbreaking in their emptiness, they stopped outside a room near the end of the hall. Through the window, Paul could see a little girl sitting up in bed, a coloring book spread across her lap. Her head was bald from chemotherapy, her skin pale, but her eyes were bright and alert, scanning the pages of her book with fierce concentration. "That's Emma," Maria said softly. "She's been here for 2 months. Her parents visit when they can, but they both work 2 jobs just to keep up with the medical bills most days. She's alone." Paul felt his chest tighten, not with pity, but with something deeper, recognition, because he had known loneliness too. He had known what it felt like to be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. "Can I go in?" he asked. Maria nodded. "Just be yourself." Paul pushed open the door gently. Emma looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of a stranger, but she didn't look scared, just curious. "Hi," Paul said softly, stepping inside. "I'm Paul. Is it okay if I sit with you for a bit?" Emma studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering on his torn hoodie and scuffed shoes. Then, without a word, she nodded and went back to her coloring book. Paul pulled up a chair beside her bed and sat down. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. He just watched as she carefully colored inside the lines of a cartoon. "Dragon," her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "That's a really cool dragon," Paul said eventually. Emma didn't look up. "His name is Spark." "Spark," Paul repeated, smiling. "That's a great name. He breathes fire," Emma added matter-of-factly. "But he's not mean. He only uses his fire to protect people." Paul nodded. "Sounds like a hero." Emma finally looked up at him, her expression serious. "Do you believe in heroes?" The question caught Paul off guard. He thought for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I do, but I don't think heroes always wear capes or have superpowers. I think sometimes heroes are just regular people who keep going even when things are really hard." Emma considered this, then pointed at her bald head. "My hair fell out because of the medicine. Does that make me a hero?" Paul's throat tightened. "Yeah, Emma, I think it does." She smiled then, small and shy, but real, and in that moment, Paul forgot about Richard Donovan. He forgot about the lobby, the judgment, the dismissal, because sitting here, with this brave little girl who colored dragons while her body fought a war she didn't ask for, this was why he came. They spent the next hour together. Paul helped Emma color. He told her stories about cars and adventures. He didn't mention movies or fame. He was just Paul, and she was just Emma, and that was enough. But as the hour passed, Paul heard something that made him pause. Voices in the hallway. One of them was Richard Donovan. "I don't care what Maria said." Richard's voice carried through the partially open door. "I told that man to leave, and if he's still in this building, I want him removed immediately." Maria's voice, firm but respectful. "Richard, he's visiting with Emma. She's happier than she's been in weeks. I don't care if he's visiting the Pope. He doesn't belong here." Paul stood slowly. Emma looked up at him, confused. "Are you leaving?" "Not yet," Paul said gently, "but I need to talk to someone first." He stepped out into the hallway, where Richard stood with his arms crossed, flanked by Marcus the security guard and another staff member. When Richard saw Paul, his expression darkened. "I thought I made myself clear," Richard said coldly. "You need to leave now." Paul met his gaze calmly. "I'm here visiting a 7-year-old girl who spends most of her days alone. I'm not causing any trouble. I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm just trying to bring a little light into her life." "You're trespassing," Richard shot back, "and if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have you arrested." Maria stepped forward. "Richard, this is insane. He's done nothing wrong." "He lied about being registered," Richard said sharply. "He bypassed protocol, and frankly, I don't trust people who show up looking like they haven't showered in a week." The words landed like a slap. The hallway went silent. Even Marcus, the security guard, looked uncomfortable. Paul took a slow breath. Then quietly, he said, "You're right about one thing. I didn't follow your protocol. and I apologize for that, but I didn't lie. I coordinated with Maria because I wanted to visit these kids without making it about me. I wanted them to see a person, not a name," Richard scoffed. "A person? You look like a vagrant." "Yeah," Paul said evenly. "I do, and that's the point, because there are people out there, real people, not actors playing a part, who look like this every day, and they deserve the same respect as anyone else. They deserve to be seen as human beings, not problems to be removed." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is a hospital, not a philosophy lecture. I'm calling the police." "Wait!" The voice came from behind them. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway of Emma's room was a woman in her early 40s dressed in nurse's scrubs. Her name tag read, Dr. Sarah Chen, Pediatric Oncology. "Dr. Chen," Richard said, his tone shifting to something more deferential. "I'm handling this." "No," Dr. Chen interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "You're not." She walked past Richard and stopped directly in front of Paul, studying him closely. Then, slowly, recognition dawned on her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're Paul Walker." The hallway froze. Richard blinked. "What?" Dr. Chen turned to him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This man you're trying to throw out? This vagrant you don't trust? He's Paul Walker, the actor, and he's here because he cares." Richard's face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks so fast it was almost comical. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came out. Paul held up a hand. "Dr. Chen, with respect, that's not why I'm here. I didn't come here to be recognized. I came here for Emma, for all these kids." Dr. Chen nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know, and that's exactly why you're a better man than most." She turned back to Richard, her voice ice cold. "You want to know what real leadership looks like? It doesn't look like a suit and tie. It doesn't look like polished shoes and fundraising galas. It looks like someone willing to sit with a scared little girl and make her smile. And you just tried to throw that person out," Richard stammered. I didn't know." "That's the problem," Paul said quietly. "You didn't know, and instead of asking, instead of listening, you judged, you assumed, and you treated me like I was less than human." Richard looked around, suddenly aware that everyone, nurses, staff, even Marcus, was staring at him. His authority, his control, it was all slipping away. I apologize," Richard said stiffly, though the words sounded forced. Paul studied him for a moment. Then he said, "It's not me you need to apologize to." Richard frowned. "What?" Paul gestured back toward Emma's room. "There's a little girl in there who thought she didn't matter, who spends her days alone because people are too busy to care, if you really want to. Make this right. Start with her. Start with all of them." The weight of Paul's words settled over the hallway like a blanket. Richard stood there, exposed, humbled, and for the first time in years, forced to confront the truth about himself. Paul turned and walked back into Emma's room. Through the window, Richard watched as the little girl's face lit up when Paul returned, her small arms reaching out for a hug, and in that moment, Richard Donovan realized something he should have known all along. The measure of a man isn't what he wears, it's what he does when no one's watching. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway of Emma's room, watching Paul Walker kneel beside the little girl's bed, his torn hoodie and scuffed shoes suddenly irrelevant in the face of the pure joy radiating from Emma's face. The child was laughing, really laughing, for the first time in weeks, her small hands gripping Paul's as he told her an animated story about a dragon named Spark who learned to fly. Behind Dr. Chen, Richard Donovan stood frozen in the hallway, his expensive suit suddenly feeling too tight, his polished shoes too heavy. The nurses and staff who had gathered weren't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him with something else. Disappointment, maybe even disgust. Maria, the nurse who had brought Paul in, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but every word carried weight. "Richard," she said, "do you know why I've worked here for 15 years? Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. "It's not because of the salary," Maria continued. "It's not because of the benefits or the prestige. It's because of moments like this." She gestured toward Emma's room. "When someone, anyone, takes the time to remind these kids that they're not just patients, they're people. They're worth loving. They're worth seeing." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once in his career he had nothing to say. Dr. Chen turned away from the window and faced Richard directly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a fire that made him take an involuntary step back. "Do you know what Emma told me last week?" Dr. Chen asked. Richard shook his head. She said she felt like she was disappearing, that people looked through her instead of at her, that she wondered if, when she finally got better and left this place, anyone would even remember she existed. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He had spent 3 years as administrator focusing on budgets, donor relations, public image. He had walked these halls 1,000 times and never once stopped to ask a child their name. "I've been working in pediatric oncology for 20 years, Dr. Chen continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what these children need, more than medicine, more than treatment, more than anything, is to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel like they matter." She took a step closer to Richard. "And you almost denied them that. Not because Paul Walker was dangerous, not because he was unqualified, but because he didn't look the way you thought he should." The silence in the hallway was suffocating. Even the usual hospital sounds, the beeping machines, the distant conversations, the overhead announcements, seemed to fade away, leaving only the truth hanging in the air. Marcus, the security guard, finally spoke. His voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Donovan, I've worked security here for 8 years, and in all that time, I've seen a lot of people walk through those doors. Rich people, poor people, famous people, nobody people. And you know what I've learned?" Richard looked at him, waiting. "The ones who look the most put together are usually the most broken inside, and the ones who look like they've got nothing, they're the ones who give everything." Marcus glanced toward Emma's room, where Paul was now helping the little girl add glitter to her dragon drawing. "That man in there," Marcus continued, "he didn't come here for recognition, he came here to give, and you tried to throw him out because you couldn't see. Past your own prejudice." Richard felt his throat tighten. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, to justify. But how could he? Every word they were saying was true. Maria stepped forward again, her expression softer now, not forgiving, but not condemning either. "Richard, I don't think you're a bad person," she said quietly. "I think you forgot why you got into this field in the first place. I think you got so caught up in the business of healthcare that you forgot about the care part." Richard looked at her, then at Dr. Chen, then at Marcus. These people, his colleagues, his staff, they had all seen what he had become, and they were all standing here, waiting to see if he had the courage to change. Slowly, Richard walked to the window of Emma's room. Inside, Paul was now showing Emma something on his phone, probably pictures of cars. Knowing Paul's reputation, the little girl's face was glowing, her laughter filling the space in a way that no amount of expensive medical equipment ever could. Richard watched them for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back down the hallway. For a moment, everyone thought he was leaving, running away from his shame. But then he stopped at the nurse's station, picked up the phone, and dialed an internal number. "This is Richard Donovan," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need you to pull up the volunteer registration system. There was an error earlier tonight. A visitor named Paul Walker should have been cleared. I want his name added to the approved list immediately. Permanent access to the children's wing." He hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, his hand still gripping the receiver. When he finally turned around, everyone was staring at him. "That's a start," Dr. Chen said simply. Richard nodded slowly. "What else do I need to do?" Maria exchanged a glance with Dr. Chen, then looked back at Richard. "Come with me," Maria said. She led Richard down the hallway, past several rooms, until they reached the end of the wing. She stopped outside a room where a young boy, maybe 9 years old, sat alone in bed, staring out the window. His name was printed on a whiteboard outside the door. Miguel Torres, age 9, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Miguel's parents work night shifts, Maria explained quietly. They can barely afford to keep the lights on at home, let alone take time off work, so most nights, Miguel is here alone. Richard looked through the window at the boy, whose thin shoulders were hunched as he gazed at the city lights outside. "Go in there," Maria said softly. "Not as the administrator, not as the man in charge. Just go in there and sit with him. Ask him about his day. Ask him what he's scared of. Ask him what he dreams about." Richard hesitated. "I don't know what to say." "Then just listen," Maria replied. "That's all any of them need, someone to listen." Richard took a deep breath, straightened his tie, a gesture that suddenly felt absurd, and pushed open the door to Miguel's room. The boy looked up, startled. "Hi," Richard said, his voice uncertain. "I'm Richard. Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Miguel shrugged, a gesture that said both, "I don't care," and "Please stay" at the same time. Richard pulled up a chair and sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then quietly, Richard asked, "What are you looking at out there?" Miguel pointed at the city lights twinkling in the distance. "My house is out there somewhere. I can't see it, but I know it's there. Do you miss it?" Miguel nodded. "Yeah, I miss my dog, and my bed, and my mom's cooking." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. "What's your dog's name?" "Rocky. He's a mutt, not fancy or anything, but he's mine." They talked for 20 minutes about Rocky, about school, about video games, about Miguel's fear that he wouldn't be able to play soccer again, even if the treatment worked. And when Richard finally left the room, his eyes were wet. Maria was waiting in the hallway. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. Richard walked back to Emma's room, where Paul was now saying goodbye. Emma was clutching a small toy car that Paul had pulled from his pocket, a tiny replica of the Nissan Skyline from the Fast and Furious movies. "This is for you," Paul had told her, "to remind you that heroes come in all kinds of shapes, even the ones who don't look like much on the outside." Paul stood and saw Richard waiting outside the door. Their eyes met. Richard stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, I owe you an apology, a real one." Paul studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I judged you," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I looked at your clothes, your appearance, and I made assumptions about who you were and what you deserved, and I was wrong, completely wrong." Paul didn't respond immediately. He just listened. "I've spent the last 3 years of my life focused on the wrong things," Richard continued, "on budgets and donors and appearances, and I forgot that. The reason this hospital exists isn't to impress people. It's to save them, to care for them, to see them." He looked past Paul into Emma's room, where the little girl was clutching her toy car like it was made of gold. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for reminding me what really matters." Paul extended his hand. Richard took it. "It's not about me," Paul said. "It's about them. And if you can remember that, then you're already on the right path." As Paul walked down the hallway toward the exit, every nurse, every staff member, every person who had witnessed what happened, stopped what they were doing and applauded. Not because he was famous, not because he was rich, but because he had shown them something they had almost forgotten. That kindness doesn't need a title. It doesn't need recognition. It just needs to be real. Richard stood alone in the hallway, watching Paul disappear around the corner. Then he looked at Maria, at Dr. Chen, at Marcus. "I have a lot of work to do," he said quietly. "Yes," Dr. Chen agreed, "you do." And for the first time in years, Richard Donovan felt like he was finally ready to do it.